The river rose in the dark like something alive, and Eleanor Whitcomb understood in that instant that if she did not run, she would die. Rain lashed down in sheets, cold and punishing, blurring the lantern-lit streets of Coldwater Crossing into streaks of gold and black. The wooden planks beneath her boots vibrated as water slammed against the bridge supports, the sound deep and furious like an animal roaring beneath the town. Eleanor clutched her belly with one trembling hand and gathered her soaked skirts with the other, breath tearing in and out of her chest as thunder cracked, so close it felt like the sky splitting open. She was 30 years old. She was visibly pregnant, and she had nowhere left to go. Only hours earlier, she had stood in the front parlor of her own house, 3 stories of brick and polished oak, the pride of Coldwater Crossing, while her husband watched her pack like a stranger, be gone before morning. Charles Whitcomb had said, his voice calm, precise, as if discussing grain prices instead of the woman carrying his child. I won't have my name dragged through the mud. Eleanor had searched his face, desperate for some flicker of the man she married. It is your child, she whispered. You know it is. Charles hadn't even looked at her belly. You were alone too often. People talk. I won't raise another man's mistake. She remembered the way the servant girl had turned her face away, the way the front door closed behind her with a final, hollow sound. That was how a rich man erased a wife. Now lightning illuminated the bridge ahead, and Eleanor saw the truth too late. The river had already reached the lower beams. Water foamed over the edges, carrying branches, fence posts, the remains of someone's barn. The sheriff had closed the road out of town. The innkeeper had refused her a room when he saw her condition and her empty hands. So she ran out. Her boots slipped on the wet planks. Wind tore at her hair, ripped loose from its pins, plastering dark strands against her face. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her lower back, sharp enough to steal her breath. She tasted iron and rain and fear. The bridge groaned. No, no, please, Eleanor cried, though there was no one left to hear her. The railing gave way with a splintering crack. The world tilted violently, lantern light spinning, sky and river becoming one blur of white and black. Eleanor screamed as her body pitched forward, her carpetbag tearing from her grasp. Then the river swallowed her. Cold slammed into her like a wall. Her mouth filled with water, her ears with thunder. She tumbled helplessly, skirts dragging, boots heavy, the current wrenching her body as if it meant to tear her apart piece by piece. Panic exploded in her chest. My child, her mind screamed. Not like this. She flailed, lungs burning, vision dimming. Something struck her shoulder. Woodstone, she couldn't tell. Pain flared, then faded into numbness. Just as darkness crept in. Fingers closed around her wrist, strong, unyielding. She broke the surface, coughing violently. Rain mixing with river water as air tore back into her lungs. A man's arm locked around her chest, hauling her toward the bank with relentless force. Eleanor glimpsed trees whipping past, lightning flashing against wet bark. The man's face half-shadowed, jaw clenched with effort. They slammed into the muddy shore. Eleanor retched and sobbed, hands digging into the earth as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. She felt the weight of a coat settle around her shoulders. Breathe, a low voice commanded. Slow. She obeyed because she could not do anything else. When she finally lifted her head, rain stinging her eyes, she saw him clearly. He was tall and powerfully built, his dark hair hanging loose down his back, soaked through. A long wool coat clung to his frame, and beneath it she glimpsed leather and bone adornments, silver catching the lightning. His face was hard-carved, weathered, with a long scar tracing from cheek to jaw. His eyes dark, steady, held no panic, no curiosity. Only certainty. An Apache. Eleanor's heart stuttered. The town spoke of Apaches in whispers and warnings. as if they were ghosts or beasts. She had never seen one this close before. "You live," he said simply. She tried to sit up and cried out as pain ripped through her abdomen, sharp and deep. Instinctively, she curled around her belly. The man's expression changed. He knelt immediately, hands hovering, careful not to touch where it hurt. "You are with child," he said, not asking. "Yes," Eleanor gasped. "Please, I can't." He pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. It was warm. It smelled of smoke and pine and something clean. "My name is Nantan," he said. "The river will rise more. You cannot stay." Lantern lights flickered in the distance along the riverbank, men shouting, searching. "They'll find us," Eleanor whispered, terror flaring anew. "They'll send me back." Nantan followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "They will not take you. Why are you helping me?" she demanded, tears streaming unchecked now. "You don't know me." He studied her face, her soaked dress, her shaking hands, the unmistakable curve of her belly. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. "Because I know what it means to be cast out," he said. Without waiting for permission, he lifted her into his arms. Eleanor stiffened in shock, then sagged, exhausted. As his strength took her weight easily, he moved into the forest, boots sure even in the mud, branches snapping underfoot as rain hammered down. Eleanor pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of him seeping through her cold. For the first time since being thrown from her home, she did not feel alone. She woke to silence. No rain, no roaring water, only the faint crackle of fire and the soft hiss of wind through pine needles. Eleanor lay on a pallet of furs inside a small log cabin, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and sap. A narrow window revealed a world transformed, snow falling gently, blanketing the forest in white. Her body ached everywhere. Her back throbbed. Her hands instinctively moved to her belly. The child stirred. Relief broke over her so suddenly she had to bite back a sob. "You are awake." Nantan knelt by the hearth, grinding dried leaves and roots with a stone. He looked different in the firelight, less severe, older somehow, lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My winter cabin," he replied. "Few know of it." She tried to sit. Pain flared again, sharp enough to make her gasp out. He crossed the room in 2 strides and supported her shoulders. "Slow," he said. "You fell hard. Did I lose?" "No," he interrupted firmly. "The child lives." Eleanor closed her eyes as tears spilled freely. She stayed there for days. Nantan brought water, food, simple things, dried meat, broth, herbs that eased her pain. He spoke little, but he watched constantly, his presence steady and unintrusive. At night, when the wind howled and the cabin creaked, Eleanor dreamed of Charles, his cold voice, the way he had looked past her as if she were already gone. One evening, as the fire burned low, the words she had been holding inside finally broke free. "I was married," she said quietly. "My husband said the child wasn't his. He threw me out." Nantan listened without interruption. "I have no home," she finished. "No protection. No name that matters." He stared into the flames for a long time before speaking. "Among my people," he said slowly, "a man who abandons his child is less than nothing." Eleanor looked at him, something tight and aching in her chest. "I will not let that be your child's fate," Nantan continued. She held her breath. "I will be husband," he said. "I will be father." The fire popped softly between them. Outside, snow fell thicker, sealing the world away, and in that quiet, fragile space, Eleanor Whitcomb felt her life begin again, terrifying, uncertain, and utterly changed. Eleanor woke to the sound of wind moving through pine needles, a soft, endless whisper that made her feel as though the world had been wrapped in wool. For a few heartbeats she did not know where she was. Then the ache in her body returned deep in her back. Sharp along her ribs, and memory flooded in. The bridge, the river, the cold hands of fear around her throat, and the man who had pulled her from the dark. She lay still, afraid that moving would break something fragile. The cabin was small but solid, built of thick logs darkened by age and smoke. A low fire burned in a stone hearth, its orange glow flickering across hanging bundles of dried herbs and strips of meat. Snowlight filtered through a narrow window, pale and quiet, nothing like the violent rain of the night before. Eleanor turned her head slightly and saw Nantan sitting on a stool near the door, repairing a leather strap with patient, practiced movements. He sensed her waking before she spoke. "You should not rise yet," he said calmly. Without looking up. "I wasn't planning to," Eleanor replied, her voice rough. She swallowed, then asked the question that had been pressing on her chest since her eyes opened. "How long have I been here?" "2 nights," Nantan said. The storm lasted longer in the mountains. 2 nights. The words unsettled her. She had never been gone from town that long without someone noticing. Without consequences. "My husband will be looking for me," she said quietly. Nantan's hands paused for only a fraction of a second before resuming their work. "Does he look for what he throws away?" The bluntness of it stole her breath. She turned her face toward the ceiling, blinking back tears she did not want to give him. "Charles doesn't like losing control," she said. "He won't let the town think I simply vanished." "That is the town's fear," Nantan replied. "Not yours." She wanted to believe that, but fear clung stubbornly to her thoughts. The sheriff. The men who had looked at her differently once her condition was visible. The law that belonged to men like Charles Whitcomb. A sudden pain twisted through her belly, sharper than before. Eleanor gasped and instinctively curled around herself. Nantan was at her side instantly. He crouched, his movements careful, and placed a warm cloth against her lower back. "Breathe slowly," he said. "Like this." She followed his rhythm, short gasps easing into deeper breaths. After a long moment, the pain receded, leaving her shaken and exhausted. "That's been happening more," she whispered. "It's too early." He studied her face, his eyes dark and focused. "Your body has been under great fear. That wakes things too soon. Will I lose the baby?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "No," he said firmly. "But you must be still." Still. Eleanor almost laughed at the word. Her entire life had been movement lately, running, packing, pleading, fleeing. Stillness felt dangerous, like waiting for a blow. Nantan helped her sip warm broth, lifting the cup with steady hands. He did not rush her. He did not speak unless she asked. There was something grounding in his presence, something that made the silence less frightening. As the day passed, Eleanor learned the cabin's quiet rhythms. The way light shifted across the floor, the creak of logs settling, the distant call of birds she could not name. She dozed often, waking to find Nantan nearby cleaning a rifle, cutting wood, preparing food. In the late afternoon, she gathered the courage to speak again. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. He considered the question, then answered simply, "It is quieter." "That's not the whole truth." "No," he agreed. She waited, unsure if he would say more. After a long pause, he did. "I once guided men through these mountains," Nantan said. "Soldiers, surveyors, railroad men. I showed them paths my people had walked for generations." Eleanor's chest tightened. "And then?" "And then they used those paths to take everything else." She pictured iron rails cutting through valleys, smoke choking the sky. "Why didn't you leave?" "This land remembers me," he said. "That is reason enough." The simplicity of it struck her deeply, that night. Eleanor dreamed of her house in Coldwater Crossing, the heavy curtains, the ticking clock in the hall. But in the dream, the rooms were empty, the furniture covered in white sheets like shrouds. When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears. Nantan had placed another blanket over her sometime in the night, on the third day. The pain returned, worse than before. Eleanor cried out, fear sharp and immediate. Nantan knelt beside her, his jaw tight as he pressed warm stones wrapped in cloth against her back. You must listen to me, he said quietly. Your body is trying to protect the child. You must not fight it. I'm scared, she whispered. I don't know what's happening. I do, he replied. And I will not leave you. The words settled over her like a vow. The pain lasted hours, then faded, leaving her trembling but alive. When it was over, Eleanor slept deeply, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. When she woke again, Nantan sat beside her, his hands folded loosely, his gaze on the fire. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her, attentive. I can't go back, Eleanor continued. Even if Charles sends for me, even if the sheriff forces me, I won't survive it. Nantan studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Then you will not go back. Her breath caught. You make it sound so simple. Sometimes it is, he said. Sometimes it is not. But the choice must be made. Eleanor hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her since the night of the storm. You said? You would be husband, father. Did you mean that? Yes, no hesitation. No qualifiers, but you don't know me, she said again. Though her voice was softer now. I know you were thrown into a river, Nantan replied. I know you chose life. I know you carry a child and refuse to let it be named nothing. That is enough to begin. Tears slid down her temples into her hair. She turned her face away, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. Far below the mountain, Coldwater Crossing buzzed with rumor. Charles Whitcomb stood in the sheriff's office, his gloved hand resting on the edge of the desk, his patience fraying. She would not simply disappear, Charles said coldly. Not in her condition. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. The river rose fast. Could be, she is alive, Charles snapped. And someone helped her. You think the Apaches, I know it, Charles interrupted. And I want her brought back. By law, she is still my wife. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his jaw. If she crossed onto reservation land, she did not, Charles said sharply. And even if she did, I will not have my name dragged through the mud by a runaway wife and a half-breed bastard. The sheriff flinched at the word but said nothing. Send men, Charles continued. Quietly. I want her found before people start asking questions. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. I'll see what can be done. Back in the mountains, unaware of the wheels turning below, Eleanor sat by the fire with Nantan, sipping tea made from bitter-smelling leaves. Her strength was returning slowly, though fear still lingered like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Will they come? She asked softly. Yes, Nantan said. Men like your husband do not let go. She nodded, gripping the cup tighter. Then what happens? Nantan looked at her steadily. Then they will learn what cannot be taken. Outside, the snow began to melt, dripping from the trees in slow, steady drops. Spring was coming, bringing danger, change, and truths that could no longer remain hidden. Eleanor rested her hand over her belly, feeling a faint movement beneath her palm, and for the first time since being cast out into the storm, she allowed herself to imagine a future that did not end in fear. The first sign that the world beyond the mountains was reaching for them again came on a morning so quiet it felt unnatural. Eleanor noticed it while standing outside the cabin, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other resting protectively over her belly. Snow still lingered in the shadows beneath the pines, but spring had begun to push through in stubborn patches of green. Birds had gone silent. No wind moved the branches. Even the creek below the ridge seemed to hold its breath. Nantan emerged from the cabin moments later, rifle in hand, his expression already darkened by instinct. "They are near," he said. Eleanor's stomach tightened, not from pain this time, but from fear. "How many?" "Enough." She swallowed hard. For weeks, life had settled into a fragile peace. Her strength had returned slowly. She learned the paths around the cabin, how to prepare food, how to recognize the signs of weather before it arrived. At night, she slept without jolting awake in terror. She had begun to believe foolishly, perhaps that the world below had forgotten her. She was wrong. Nantan guided her inside, closing the heavy wooden door with deliberate care. "You will stay here," he said, "no matter what you hear." Eleanor caught his arm. "I won't hide while they take you." "They will not take me," he replied calmly. "But fear makes men reckless." A distant shout echoed through the trees. Eleanor's breath came shallow. "Charles will not stop," she whispered. "He'll lie. He always does." "I know," Nantan said. Boots crunched on snow and dead needles. Shapes moved between the trees, men on horseback, rifles slung across their shoulders, coats bearing the marks of cold water crossing. At their center rode Charles Whitcomb, his posture stiff, his expression carved from entitlement and rage. The sheriff dismounted first, removing his hat as he approached the clearing. He looked older than Eleanor remembered, lines of worry etched deep around his mouth. "Nantan," the sheriff called. "We need to talk." Nantan stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "You have come far for words." Charles pushed past the sheriff, his eyes locking onto Eleanor through the cabin window. "There she is," he said sharply. "Eleanor, come out. This ends now." Eleanor's heart hammered as she stepped onto the porch, one hand gripping the railing for balance. Her pregnancy was impossible to hide now, her dress stretched tight over her belly. The sheriff winced. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you shouldn't be out in the cold." "I'm not your concern," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Charles scoffed. "You see what he's done to her? Keeping her out here like some—" "She chose to stay," Nantan interrupted. Charles turned on him, eyes blazing. "You don't get to speak for her." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice rising. "I do. I chose this. I chose him." The words landed like a blow. The sheriff rubbed his temple. "Eleanor, by law, my husband threw me into the street," she cut in. "By law, he refused to claim his own child. By law, he left me to die in a storm." Charles's face flushed. "You're lying." "I almost drowned," Eleanor said. "Ask the river." Silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitcomb claims you are being held against your will." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "If I were being held, I'd be dead." Nantan's voice cut through the tension. "You have no claim here. This land is mine." He reached into his coat and withdrew folded papers, worn but intact. He handed them to the sheriff. The sheriff scanned the documents slowly. His brow furrowed. "These are valid." Charles stiffened. "That's impossible." "They're not," the sheriff said quietly. "He served as a scout. These lands were granted." Charles's jaw clenched. "She is still my wife." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Only on paper. And paper burns." Charles's hand twitched toward his coat. Nantan saw it. The moment shattered. Charles drew his pistol in a flash of rage, aiming not at Nantan but at Eleanor. Time slowed to a crawl. Eleanor froze, terror rooting her to the spot. Nantan moved. The rifle swung up, striking Charles's wrist as the gun fired. The shot went wild, tearing bark from a pine behind the cabin. Charles screamed as the pistol fell from his grasp. Men shouted. Horses reared. Nantan slammed Charles to the ground with terrifying force, his knee pressing into his chest, rifle barrel inches from his throat. "Enough," Nantan said, his voice deadly calm. "You will leave." The sheriff raised his hands. "Easy. Easy, no more blood." Charles struggled, gasping. "You can't, she belongs to me." Eleanor stepped forward, shaking but resolute. "I don't belong to anyone." The sheriff bent to retrieve the fallen pistol. He examined it, then looked at Charles with a hardened expression. "You drew first," he said. "That matters." Charles stared up at him in disbelief. "You'd side with him?" "I'm siding with the law," the sheriff replied. "And with common sense." Nantan released Charles slowly, rising to his full height. "You came to take," he said. "You failed." The man hesitated, uncertain. No one wanted to be the next to step forward. Charles scrambled to his feet, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat. "It is," Eleanor said quietly. "For me." The sheriff mounted his horse, motioning for the others to follow. "We're leaving," he said. "There's nothing more to be done here." Charles lingered a moment longer, staring at Eleanor as if trying to carve her into memory. Then he turned away. The forest swallowed them. When the last sound of hooves faded, Eleanor's legs gave out. Nantan caught her before she fell, his hand steady as he lowered her onto the porch. "You shouldn't have come out," he said softly. "I had to," she replied. "If I don't face him now, I never will." He studied her, then nodded once. "You are stronger than you know." That night, the pain returned, not sharp this time, but heavy and relentless. Eleanor lay curled on the pallet, breathing through each wave as Nantan stayed at her side, speaking to her in a low, steady voice. "You are safe," he murmured. "No one will take you." Her hand found his, gripping tightly. "If something happens, nothing will," he said firmly. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new growth. Far below, Coldwater Crossing changed. Rumors spread fast. The story twisted as it traveled. Some said Eleanor had been kidnapped, others that she had chosen a savage over her husband. But there were also whispers that Charles Whitcomb had fired first, that the sheriff had seen it with his own eyes. Business partners grew wary. Doors closed. Credit tightened. Charles drank more. One evening, alone in his grand house, he stared at the empty parlor where Eleanor once stood. The silence pressed in on him, thick and accusing. He clenched his fists. "You think you've won," he muttered. "You haven't." Back in the mountains, Eleanor felt her child kick strongly for the first time. She gasped, then laughed through tears. "Did you feel that?" Nantan placed his hand gently over her belly. The movement came again, firm and unmistakable. His breath caught. For the first time since she had known him, his composure cracked. "Yes," he whispered. "I did." Eleanor leaned into him, fear and hope colliding inside her. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Nantan nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkened forest beyond the window. "Yes," he said, "together." And though danger still lingered in the world below, something unbreakable had already taken root in the mountains, something no law, no hatred, no river could wash away. The first cry of the child cut through the mountain air just as the sun crested the ridge. Thin and bright, turning the frost on the pines into fire, Eleanor barely heard it at first. Pain had swallowed the world whole, long, relentless waves that bent her spine and stole her breath. Her hands clutched the furs beneath her, knuckles white, sweat slicking her hair to her temples despite the cold. She had never known her body could break open like this and still endure. Nantan knelt beside her, calm as stone, his presence an anchor in the chaos. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, words she didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. He wiped her brow, supported her back, guided her breathing when fear threatened to take over. "You are not alone," he told her again and again. "You are strong. Stay with me." Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing earth. Spring had fully claimed the mountains. When the child finally came, slippery and wailing and alive, Eleanor sobbed so hard she thought her chest would split. Nantan lifted the baby with reverent hands, as though holding something sacred, then placed her gently against Eleanor's skin. A girl. Perfect. Loud, furious at the world. Eleanor laughed and cried at once, pressing her face into the baby's damp hair. "You're here," she whispered. "You're really here." Nantan watched them both, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. He had seen death many times in his life on battlefields, in winters that took the week, in the quiet moments when breath simply stopped. This was different. This was creation, fierce and undeniable. "She is strong," he said. Eleanor nodded, exhausted and overwhelmed. She had to be. They named her Ayanna, a word Nantan spoke softly, like a promise. Eternal bloom. For a time, the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist. Days passed in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Eleanor learned the rhythms of her daughter's cries, the way her tiny fingers curled instinctively around a thumb. Her body healed slowly, painfully, but with each sunrise she felt herself returning changed, but alive. Nantan built a cradle from pine, smoothing every edge with care. At night, he sat by the fire with Ayanna against his chest, humming low melodies that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Eleanor watched them, her heart aching with something too big to name. Word traveled, as it always did. Trappers passing through the high valley spoke of a woman who had survived the river, of an Apache man who had claimed a child not born of his blood, of a place in the mountains where no one was turned away hungry or afraid. Some stories twisted into ugliness, others into hope. Down in Coldwater Crossing, Charles Whitcomb unraveled. Business partners withdrew quietly at first, citing concerns, then openly refusing to extend credit. The mill stood idle more often than not. Workers whispered. The town that once bowed to him now watched with narrowed eyes. The sheriff visited him one evening, standing stiffly in the doorway of the grand house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. "You need to let this go," the sheriff said. "There's nothing left to chase." Charles poured himself another drink, his hand shaking. "She humiliated me." "She survived you," the sheriff corrected. "That's not the same thing." Charles laughed bitterly. "You sided with him." "I sided with the truth," the sheriff said. "And you nearly shot a pregnant woman." The words hung heavy in the air. "She's mine," Charles insisted weakly. "No," the sheriff replied. "She never was?" Weeks later, Charles rode into the mountains alone. No posse, no warrants, just desperation and a pistol. He found the cabin at dusk. Eleanor saw him first, standing at the edge of the clearing like a ghost of the man she once knew. Her heart lurched, fear flaring instinctively, but it did not own her anymore. Nantan stepped forward, placing himself between Charles and the door. Without a word, Charles looked thinner, older. His eyes were hollow. "I didn't come to fight," he said hoarsely. Nantan said nothing. Eleanor emerged slowly, Ayanna bundled against her chest. The sight of the child seemed to strike Charles harder than any blow. He stared, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "She looks like you," he finally said. Eleanor's voice was calm. "She looks like herself." Charles swallowed. "I lost everything." "That was your doing," Eleanor replied. "Not mine." "I want to see her," he said, desperation cracking his voice. "Just once." Nantan's jaw tightened. Eleanor held his gaze, then shook her head. No, Charles flinched. I'm her father. No, she said again, firmer. You are not. Silence stretched between them, thick and final. Charles laughed softly, a broken sound. You chose him. I chose life, Eleanor said. You chose pride. Something in Charles seemed to collapse. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, Eleanor almost pitied him. Double quotes. Goodbye, Charles, she said. He turned away without another word, disappearing back into the trees. She never saw him again. Months later, news came from town. Charles Whitcomb had died alone, his heart giving out after a night of heavy drinking. The mill closed. The house was sold. The sheriff rode up to the cabin one crisp morning, removing his hat as he approached. I came to make things official, he said, handing Eleanor a folded document. Your marriage was dissolved by abandonment. You're free in the eyes of the law. Eleanor took the paper, then folded it carefully and tucked it away. Thank you. The sheriff glanced at Nantan, then at the child gurgling happily in Eleanor's arms. Town's changed, he said quietly. People talk different now. Change comes whether people like it or not, Nantan replied. The sheriff nodded. That it does. After he left, Eleanor stood watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Ayanna slept peacefully against her chest, warm and solid and real. I used to think survival was the end of a story, Eleanor said softly. Like once you lived through the worst of it, that was all there was. Nantan joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. And now? Now I know it's only the beginning. They built more than a life in the mountains. Others came runaways, widows, men broken by the railroads, and women with nowhere else to turn. Nantan taught them the land. Eleanor taught them to endure. A small community took shape, bound not by blood or law, but by choice. Years later, Ayanna ran laughing through the trees, fearless and wild, her parents watching from the porch of a home that had grown larger. Stronger. Eleanor took Nantan's hand, lacing her fingers through his. You kept your word, she said. I will always, he replied. And in the high country, where rivers once tried to claim her and the world tried to erase her, Eleanor Whitcomb stood whole wife, mother, and survivor, her past finally at rest, her future unafraid.